You think Roger Federer got good at serving by serving and being like, I've served so much, I don't feel like this anymore. I'm going to go play ping pong.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Truth Talks, the podcast that brings you real strategies for sustainable fitness transformation. Anybody who's been on a sustainable fitness journey or any kind of fitness journey, I think is very well aware that there's ebbs and flows to it, right? Like it's, especially the longer you go, the longer you realize there are these moments of breakthrough, there's moments of slowdown. What would you say, Paris? Like, you agree with that?
Yeah, it's really like a roller coaster, and most people think it's this linear line that you're just gonna like keep climbing this like linear path until you reach this dream goal and then it's over. But in reality, it's just this continual game, and there's gonna be lots of ups and there's gonna be lots of downs. So you need to expect that it's gonna be a roller coaster.
And sometimes amongst the ups and downs, there's even a flat line. And so I think that's today the piece of the journey that we're going to talk about. The idea of it not being a linear journey is definitely a huge concept, and I think fluctuations should be expected, and we'll talk about that in another day. But for now, we're going to talk about the flatline moments, the moments that we often refer to as a plateau, right? It's just things feel flat. We don't necessarily feel like we're moving up or down or in any particular direction. We feel stuck. And I think everybody can kind of relate to that at some point. And before we get into the details of what is a plateau, I do want to say that it serves a purpose, because sometimes feeling a little bit stuck can be, hey, we've actually reached a new level. Like if you think about climbing a mountain and you get to the very top and then it's flat and you're like, oh my God, thank God I've got here. I've made it. I've reached this next level. So sometimes it's really productive. You're like, it's a moment in time that's a milestone.
It's a step on a staircase. Yeah.
100%. But then the other piece of it is sometimes you get to this point and you're like, well, I don't really know like where to go next. I was expecting like I was going to keep going up, but this part's flat. And so like, I feel like it's not a milestone, but I don't really know which direction to go in. And so that's kind of the plateau piece I think we're going to be talking a little bit more about today, which is when you get to that feeling where you're like, I don't know how to keep moving forward.
Yeah, or when you're deliberately trying to make progress in a certain direction, but it's the perception of progress is not there.
Great definition. So, because you just gave us a great way of thinking about it, what is a plateau? Like, let's dive right into that. What is a plateau in your fitness journey?
Yeah, so a point in time where you are doing the things that you think are going to drive progress, but you're not seeing the progress for whatever reason that you think you should be seeing. And we can divide that into, let's just, for practicality, it could be like muscle growth, it could be fat loss, or sometimes just mentally as well. Like you don't feel like you're moving forward in mental position. You kind of like your mindset or your the way you feel is just kind of like,
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important to actually give some credence to the idea of different ways of looking at a plateau, right? Because I think we often think, well, it's really easy with fat loss. It's like, okay, the scale didn't move, or I don't feel like I look any different or any of that. Like we'll talk about that in a little bit about how you identify it. But those sorts of things are really, they're physical, they're tangible. But the plateau in your mind is kind of just as important, because if you feel mentally stuck and your energy levels aren't there, you're not reaping the benefits of like confidence or those other subjective experiences that your fitness journey should also be about, you're probably not going to put in the energy of like also doing the things to push you along in other dimensions, whether that's physical or otherwise, right?
It's going to affect your outputs.
Yeah.
It's going to affect your outputs because your inputs are affected, right? You're not going to put in the same oomph of inputs, and therefore you won't get the same.
Exactly. And the reason why it's important to address, half of it is, okay, well, if you have goals, you want to make sure you're continuing to work towards those goals. If they're muscle growth, fat loss, any sort of physical transformation, or even strength in the gym, performance, same thing applies there. But the other side of it is, it can be really discouraging when you get there. So breaking through a plateau isn't just about promoting progress towards those very tangible goals. It's also about keeping you locked in, keeping you focused, because getting discouraged on your journey is probably the number one barrier to like keeping you going.
Yes, absolutely. When people get discouraged, like we're making crazy progress. We're like, yes, positive reinforcement. Let me keep doing all the things. But if you have a period of time where you're not seeing progress and you're like, oh, this is not good, and then you your behaviors change, and all of a sudden you're seeing less progress again, and then some people just give up or say, oh, you know what, I don't know why I'm doing this anymore.
It becomes a bit of a downward spiral at that point. And then you don't even know, like, what if you had kept going? And what if you found a way to break through that feeling of discouragement and see what was on the other side? So that instead of staying in the flat zone or potentially turning around and walking back down the hill, like, you're actually like, oh, what's up there? Like, okay, if you made it to Everest Base Camp, you can either turn around and go back, you could stay there, or you could go up to the peak, which obviously, please don't do unless you're very qualified. I am not. But the same concept applies. Like, there's usually something else waiting for you if you break through that plateau. That's exactly what this episode is about today, after that long intro. Today's question that we are answering is, how do you break through a plateau?
Yeah,
and we just defined what that is, and why it's important. We're going to follow that up today with some very practical next steps for you.
Yeah, so let's start with fat loss because this is a common one. So let's break it down: fat loss, muscle growth, and then we'll talk a bit more about like mindset wise.
Right. Because first things first is plateaus look different depending on your goals. And
absolutely.
Because we only have 30 minutes, we're not going to be able to cover like every single fitness goal out there. So we are going to focus on the main ones. And because we focus on fitness transformation and physique specifically, we are going to lean a little bit more towards that. But if there is something else you'd like us to address as relative to your fitness journey and how you're feeling as a plateau or not, please drop a comment. We'll be sure to tackle that another point in time.
Yeah, good point. So in terms of fat loss specifically, I think first things first, you actually need to make sure that you're at a true plateau. And not seeing your scale weight go down for 4 days is not a plateau, okay? And people make crazy adjustments based on that because they get emotional. A lot of times in our fitness journey, we make emotional decisions, and that's why it's good to have somebody objective to bounce ideas off and stuff like that. So if you're in a fat loss phase, right, and all of a sudden you think you're in a fat loss plateau, first you need to make sure that you have a few boxes checked to ensure you're truly in a fat loss plateau, right? The first one would be, is your adherence to your nutrition strategy good? Okay. If you're, 3 days on, 3 days off, doesn't count. Like 80% or more of the time, are you hitting the whatever strategy you should be hitting for your nutrition?
Can I just break that down? I think with the nutrition, there's the, hey, am I actually doing the thing I'm setting out to do? And that has two different looks to it. There's, let's say it's numbers, right? So it's calories or macros or any of that. Are you hitting those? If not, okay, then you gotta do that first. But the second piece of it is like, how do you know if you're hitting it or not? Because I think a lot of people will be like, yeah, but I'm eating these calories, but we are really, really, really bad. Like, science and research has shown us how bad we are at actually knowing what we're eating. So when you're asking yourself, am I actually sticking to my nutrition protocol? Is my adherence there? You need to evaluate it from two lenses. It's like, are the numbers that you're looking at telling you that you are or not? And then how confident are you actually in those numbers?
The accuracy component.
The accuracy component.
So let's say we're hitting our targets and we're accurate.
Right. Yes. So I just had to say that because I think it's just all too common, and like, it is a skill, right? So I'm not bashing people for not being accurate. It's hard. It is a hard skill to develop. But if you are not 1,000, not even just 100, 1,000% sure that you are being accurate, then maybe trying to build out those skills would be more beneficial.
Yeah, 100%. So first one, definitely nutrition. Same thing goes with training. Like, are we hitting our workouts? Are we following a specific program that we know is logical and good for us, and we're hitting those workouts with intention? And then, continuing on with that, same thing with whatever expenditure we're doing, mostly if that's steps or additional cardio, are we completing that level of expenditure as well? If we have those three boxes checked, then we need to say, are we playing the consistency game as well? Because I could do those for a week and be like, I've already done these. So we need to make sure we've been doing those consistently, I would say, for at least 3 weeks, we'll say. And within those 3 weeks, it's not just my scale didn't go down. It's scale weight didn't go down, but also I didn't see any visual changes, but also I didn't have any subjective measures of progress, like my belt was looser or my pants feel different or my shirt feels like it fits better. You have to have multiple ways of tracking progress and look at a longer time horizon than I just didn't hit a new low weight in the past 4 days.
In a nutshell, first things first is, are you sticking to the plan that you have? If you don't have a plan, that's also a problem. Sticking to the plan that you have, doing it consistently for a certain time horizon that is not 4 days, not 1 day, at least 3. I think you said 3, right? At least 3 weeks before you evaluate. Weeks? Yes, 3 weeks. And then knowing how you're evaluating that and looking at all dimensions of progress to say, am I sure that none of these progress indicators are moving?
Yes.
That last one I think is particularly important because we often also get really hung up on one sole indicator of progress. So sometimes you are making progress, you're just not seeing it because you're looking at the wrong data, or you're not taking all data into account. Right? A lot of people go through like body recomposition. And if you're not taking progress photos, if the scale's not changing, it doesn't mean you're not making progress. So you really, really need to be sure that you are looking at it from multiple angles if you are genuinely trying to get an accurate representation of if you're in a plateau.
100%. And you know what's funny in terms of body recomp? I see this with women even more, where we could have a very similar body weight, but the composition changes quite significantly. And that's why it's important to take consistent progress pics. But they're also the ones that tend to be more emotional about the scale as well. But they're also the ones that have larger body water fluctuations due to cycles and cyclical nature of their hormones, right? So it's like we have all these things stacked in favor, which it just influences the reason why we can't just look at scale weight, even though they're usually I'm blanket statementing this, if that's a word, but they're usually the ones that get a bit more emotional about the numbers.
That's fair. I mean, we've also been exposed to all this messaging that's told us to care about those numbers. So I'm not going to go into that big topic.
Yes, for sure.
I will say we did do an awesome, I think it's awesome, episode on how to evaluate progress in your fitness journey that really goes into all the different metrics you should look at beyond the scale. And so I'll link that up in kind of the YouTube cards here, and again in the description below, so you have easy access to it. I think it's worth watching or tuning into if you want to be evaluating if you're making progress before you can actually know if you're in a plateau or not.
100%. So that is kind of the way first we identify that we are in a plateau. Would you agree that's a good kind of thought process?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm just going to reiterate that we are talking specifically here about fat loss just because it is such a common goal, and we'll dive into the other goals in just a moment. Quickly rehashing. First things first, are you sticking to your plan across 3 different dimensions: nutrition, training, and any other sort of expenditure? Then, are you sticking to it consistently for a valid time horizon, at least 3 weeks? And then lastly are all indicators of progress telling you that you are not making progress? Yes. All indicators, not just the scale.
Yes, perfect summary. And if those boxes are all checked, then we know that we're probably at a fat loss plateau. And in that case, we need to play with the calorie balance equation, where we probably need to increase expenditure and or decrease food. Now, there's a lot of different ways to do this, and it really is largely context dependent on where you are in your journey, where your current intake is at, where your current expenditure is at, what's the context of your training program and your body composition. Like, there's so many things to consider.
Your lifestyle. Like, and your lifestyle. How practical is it for you to actually deploy adjustments too?
Definitely. And like, how assertive do you need to be? Is there a specific time range, like a photo shoot or a show or something that you need to like be ready in time for? You might step on the gas a little bit harder than you would otherwise. So those are all things that we really need to think about. But as a general rule of thumb, you will need to adjust either one of those variables or both of them at the same time, typically a combination of the two. As an example adjustment that we might make when we're at a fat loss plateau could be we can shift our calorie range down by like 150 calories, and we could bump up our steps by 2,000, for example.
I like that you specified the degree of a recommended adjustment. And again, of course, it's dependent on the individual, but as a starting thing for people to think about, it's not go cut another 500 calories, because that's going to be a challenge. Like, the practical realities that you're going to feel, like hunger and energy and training capacity and performance, they're all going to tank if you just go ahead and cut 500 calories. But I think people would be surprised how a small adjustment can actually really manifest, especially if you're consistently adhering to it. If you think about, like, okay, I'm taking an extra 100 calories out every day for a week, that's another 700 calories out of your week. Like, that can make a difference.
It can. And sometimes, like, the math doesn't make sense if you think, okay, there's 3,500 calories in a pound of fat. So I need to reduce calories by 500 calories a day to then lose a pound of fat per week. And they do these crazy adjustments. But in reality, it is these tiny adjustments that can go a long way, even if the math doesn't math, right? You're like, how can 700 calories a week, how come that all of a sudden made me see more fat loss progress? But it does work like that in practice. And I've seen it again and again and again. Like, on the aggressive side, 300 calorie adjustments, and on the more conservative side, like 100 calorie reductions.
And I think it's also important to remember, like, you're already in a calorie deficit. This is assuming you're already in a calorie deficit, and then you're taking that extra 100 calories away when you hit that plateau, right? It's not saying like, okay, you only need 100 calories as a deficit necessarily. It's also thinking about, this is revving your engine, right? It's already turned on. You're just revving it up.
Yeah, like you're already at the targets. That should be a calorie deficit for you, not off what you're eating right now. Don't make an adjustment. You're
Right.
off you've been continually dieting. You check those boxes that are a plateau. Now you're making an adjustment. That's an important thing to think about. And again, there's a lot of ways that you can increase expenditure. Easiest one is just quantify steps, anywhere from like 1,000 to 3,000 increase in daily steps. Or maybe you're doing 2 sessions a week of 20 minutes on the Stairmaster or whatever. Okay, maybe you add a third and you bump them all up to like 25 minutes. Again, there's so many nuances with this, but we're just giving you things to think about when you are trying to make adjustment.
Sounds great. So first, making sure you're actually in that plateau, and then in a fat loss phase, those are the things you want to be doing as potential adjustments to keep things moving forward. And then you go back to the beginning. You go, okay, give myself minimum 3 weeks. Am I sticking to my plan, my new plan? Am I executing it consistently over the course of at least 3 weeks? What are the measures of progress I'm looking at? And it becomes this continuous cycle.
For sure. And of course, we could talk about in cases where your way of breaking the plateau is actually giving yourself a break from a deficit too. That's a whole nother story that we can talk about. But it's not always just a race to the bottom. We should highlight that as well. But that's a whole different discussion. But I do want to say that's another context where you might actually just take yourself out of a deficit for a bit as you're plateau breaking.
Yeah, because just going back to where we started, we talked about how sometimes the plateau is very mental and emotional too, right? So if you are just like, I just don't have it in me right now to keep pushing, that's okay. Or maybe something happened in life. You're like, I just need to divert energy towards this. So continuing to dig harder on fat loss might not be the right thing for you at that time. And if you do need a bit of that mental reset, like you said, taking a break from dieting, taking a break from fat loss phase could be the thing that helps you break through that mental plateau and then get back at it at a different point in time.
For sure. Very interestingly, if you've been dieting for a long time and lost a significant portion of body fat, if you go up to maintenance for a bit, even if you're at a plateau and then go right back down to the same protocol you had when you were dieting previously before the maintenance phase, a lot of times the body responds very well. And there's a whole conversation around like how our bodies adapt to calorie deficits and different things like that, but we won't talk about that now, but just giving some other things.
Just something to keep in mind is like, it's because it's not linear, right? Like you don't just have to constantly be on that downward trajectory either. So keep in mind that one of the ways you can break through a plateau is taking a break. And we'll talk about diet breaks and doing so effectively in a different episode. But just keep that in mind if you are looking at breaking through a plateau. That could be a possibility for you. Okay, so we just tackled fat loss plateaus. Do you also want to touch on muscle growth plateaus?
Yes, this one is a little bit tougher because muscle growth, the analogy I've used before, as you might have watched in my reel, is muscle growth is like walking up the stairs and fat loss is like sliding down the banister in terms of the time horizon. So I would be very cautious to make quick decisions in a muscle building phase for the first reason being it's like watching paint dry compared to fat loss. So you really need to make sure that you're at a plateau. The second is because typically you're at higher body fat when you're in a building phase, the changes are harder to see. And sometimes, especially if you're very experienced, you might do like a 10-month building phase to not know if you're actually building muscle under there until you then do your next cut and you're like, oh, I did put on tissue. Because it's the more body fat you have, the harder it is to see if you've actually built muscle. And the further you are in your training career, theoretically, the less muscle you can build per unit of time. And therefore, you have to really wait almost sometimes until you do the next cut. But with that being said, if you are...
Hold on. Yeah. Quick recap. So not only does that 3-week kind of time horizon that we talked about definitely not apply for muscle growth. So not only do you need insane levels of patience, don't even think about plateaus until we're talking months now into this journey. And you have so much noise and data. Like you said, right? Like you can't always see it as visually, right? Muscle growth is a very visual thing. Just as like the scale has its issues with fat loss, at least it is, I would say, more dependable in a fat loss phase than a muscle growth phase, because you could be putting on a lot of weight. Doesn't mean you're gaining muscle.
Yeah, for sure.
Right? Like, in fact, sometimes you might be putting on not that much weight and actually gaining muscle. You do have a lot of data complications when it comes to analyzing your plateau. in addition to the time patience factor. I just wanted to highlight those two things because I think they're huge differentiators from a fat loss progress, I guess, phase, because you need much more time before you even start thinking about plateaus. And when you do start thinking about them, you have to be crystal clear on what you're looking at because it is very, very complicated and often masked.
Yes, for sure, for sure. And with that being said, I think the main thing you do want to pay attention to because of how slow the process of building muscle, unless you're a beginner, you can make some gains pretty quick. But if you're already into lifting, let's say, look at your performance and use that as a key indicator. Because if you're applying progressive overload over time and you're recovering well and coming back and performance is going up nicely over the training blocks and over the weeks, you're probably adding new lean tissue if you're sleeping well, eating enough protein, and right?
Training performance specifically. So when we're talking about looking at performance, we're talking about performance in the gym of your lifts. And can you just break that down one step further in terms of what are the metrics someone can look at if they're looking to analyze training performance?
Yeah, so very simply, are we able to add reps over time with the same load? Are we able to add load given the same reps or even more reps, right? And then also maybe we've improved technique by using the same load and the same reps. Those are all the major signs that we're progressing over time. So that's like the key thing to look at when you don't have any positive reinforcement in a building phase because of the visual lag, we'll call it. Look at your training performance.
So I would say a muscle growth progression or the indicators of progress versus plateau when it comes to muscle growth are actually way more about your inputs than your outputs. Like your training program is your inputs. It is the thing you need to do in order to put on muscle. And like I would say also like eating enough protein is another input. You need to do that. So when you think about it, it is a different lens because you're not waiting on this like delayed signal. You are able to at least think on a regular basis, am I doing the inputs? And if those inputs are sufficient and progressing, then that might be enough to be confident that you're not in a plateau yet.
Yes. In a muscle building phase, because you're getting less frequent feedback, you almost need to just logic away through it and say, what would the boxes need to be checked for me to gain muscle? And a big thing is the training and creating an environment to build muscle, like being at a reasonable body fat percentage, eating enough, and not being in a deficit. So like we need to be at maintenance or preferably in a slight surplus, and that can kind of feed into the next point of, for most people, you do want to be seeing some sort of rate of gain over the months. And usually we look on weekly averages for fat loss and rolling averages, but I would argue look on monthly rolling averages for your building phases. We want to create a good environment for muscle growth, and we know we should probably do that at maintenance or in a slight surplus. Okay. Now, the degree of that is going to be different again, depending on the context of your journey and your level of advancement, but that's something to think about. So you might want to set like a monthly rate of gain if you are in a building phase.
And when you're saying monthly rate of gain, I just want to specify in case it wasn't clear for everybody that we're talking about body weight gain in that context.
Yeah. And if I could give like a rough idea, if you're a very, very, very beginner, you could probably be building like, 2% of your body weight per month is probably a reasonable place to go. If you're more advanced, you might slide more towards that 1%, area. But again, these are just rough guidelines to kind of base your decision making off. So that's the other thing. And then, but really, are your sleeves tighter? Right. Like, do you look more jacked in the gym? Can you see visually the progress? Like, those are going to be the things that are really going to drive it. I care much more about that than your body weight. But again, as I said, typically the cost of doing business is a little bit more body fat. So if you're at a higher body fat level, sometimes it's harder to see the gains that you're making.
So how do you start to make adjustments, or when do you start to make adjustments in a gaining phase? Like, are there certain indicators where you're like, okay, I think you might actually be at a plateau? Like, or do we just have to kind of wait and see what happens? Or can we actually identify a plateau and then make some adjustments and keep going?
Yeah, it's a tough one, right? Because your time horizons are so long. But I definitely think that if you're still at a reasonable body fat percentage where you're okay still putting on some more mass, I would say then if you're consistently not increasing your body weight over like, 6-week time frame or whatever, then I would push food up a little bit.
I'll just use my own personal experience here because this literally just happened to me. I switched from I switched from a mini cut back into a bit of a gaining phase. And I worked with my own coach, shout out Munene, to actually kind of like, okay, get back on track and then look at different dimensions to say, are we doing as much as we can to provoke muscle growth? And what ended up happening was after, 6 to 8 weeks, I can't remember the exact timeline, my body weight actually stayed the same. And I was so hungry and my training performance numbers were all going up. So we did make a slight adjustment to my calorie intake up just by a little bit. Again, we're talking like 100, 150 calories here because body weight was stagnant over an extended period of time and training performance was actually thriving. So the demands on my body and the demands for muscle growth were definitely there. And my subjective signals around appetite were also indicating to me that, okay, let's keep going. We're ready. Yeah. A lot of people, I think, in gaining phases, you think about the person who's like cramming every mouthful of food into their mouth. It's like, okay, you like might need to don't make an adjustment and give yourself more food quite yet.
Yeah. Run a cut and to resystem appetite and everything. That's a whole different story too. But it's a great point. The way especially for our more advanced clients like Manene, the tools or the thought process that I go through in terms of making adjustments is how do we provide the nutrition that's going to support us getting the stimulus that we want in the gym?
Yes.
So it's less like, okay, how much do we need to build? It's like, okay, what's the amount of food that we need to support the training demands that are going to stimulate muscle growth and allow us to perform and recover from those training demands? That's the answer to our question.
Yeah, because when you're in that fat loss phase, your adjustments are around nutrition to provoke fat loss, but your training is kind of that like, keep training a little bit more steady as best as you can.
For sure.
Because it's more of like maintaining, right? But then when you're in that muscle growth phase, like you become much more reliant on training output and progression as those indicators of progress. So your nutrition is like supporting that even more so versus kind of the other way around, I guess.
Yeah, it's just like perspective shifts, right? Most of the time for beginners, as I said, you can put on muscle very quickly. You can probably eat in a slightly larger surplus and gain weight a little bit quicker and still just put on mostly muscle tissue.
So as we said from the very beginning, evaluating muscle growth progress and therefore muscle growth plateaus is much more complicated than when it comes to fat loss. I think fat loss, you can see, is quite formulaic. If this, then that. With muscle growth, there's a lot of noise. There's a lot more complexity. There's a longer time period. So you need to be patient, which is not always easy. But hopefully we just provided a few things for you to think about. And specifically, I'd say the number one thing to look at is like, look at your lifts. That's what you called out from the beginning. Like, look at your training performance. Look at those inputs in a very long time horizon. We're talking months. And you should at least start to evaluate a little bit more of if your progress is able to keep continuing.
Awesome. I know lots of nuances, but I'm glad we touched on that. Do you want to touch on the last one before we leave the watchers / listeners on the kind of emotional plateaus?
Yeah, emotional plateaus are really big. I think it is important because no matter what your physique goal is, no matter what your, like training goal or performance goal is, all that aside, you bring your mental headspace and your emotions forward every single day. And I think if you are feeling like you are stuck in an emotional plateau, that also takes different shapes and different forms. It is going to be different for different people. Some people, that emotional plateau is like in the form of confidence. For other people, it's just boredom, let's be honest. And for some people, it's more energy, right? So I think the first step I would say is like, if you're feeling that plateau isn't so much about the progress indicators from an external perspective, but it's more internal, how you feel every day, first ask yourself, like, what is it? Like, is it confidence? Is it energy? Is it fatigue? Is it just boredom? Like, what is that kind of mental block that is keeping you feeling stagnant? And then if you are able to identify that, sometimes I think it's okay to take I'm going to call it imperfect action, right? Or having imperfect intentions. Because it doesn't have to be around like what's going to get you the main outcome. It's about what's going to allow you to sidestep and break down that emotional plateau barrier and then find another way to move around. So did you have a build on that?
Yeah, sometimes you might make a call that's like not optimal on paper just for the sake of you being able to like feel more excited about the process. For example, like maybe you do change phases, not because optimal on paper, but just because you feel like it, or maybe you change the way you're training for a bit just for some variety, like to freshen things up, so
yeah, absolutely. Or maybe it is actually just allowing you, this is so simple, but like if you're in a fat loss phase and you're really digging and you're like, I need that break because I just want to have some pizza and call it a day. Okay, like maybe you just need a little bit of a period where you're like not thinking about the decision fatigue of what you're eating every second of the day. Or if you're in a muscle growth phase and you're like, you know what, we alluded to this earlier, I really want to like love eating again. Okay, maybe you do like a mini cut, even though could have been theoretically more advantageous if you kept trying to grow. Taking that step sideways and shifting gears a little bit. That was a very simplistic example, I think, that I just walked through. But I would say if I had to summarize it, it's first and foremost, if you are going through a mental or emotional plateau, identify what that feeling actually is, and then what is the thing that's going to allow you to break through it.
Yeah, it's all self-awareness, and sometimes you just need to let it pass. Like the last 2 weeks, I was in one of those mental plateaus, but I've been through enough of those where it's like, just do the things, and then eventually the psychology catches up. So it's just like acknowledging that like we're not always going to feel like, this is the best day ever and I'm crushing everything and I can't wait to do all this work and gym stuff, right? Sometimes it's just this too shall pass type situation, and just like do the things you need to do and you'll feel fine next week, So
right. Yeah. And this is going back to what we talked about with kind of this whole conversation, which is give yourself a time horizon before you evaluate. Yes. So if you feel that mental block or that emotional block for 2, 3, 4, 5 weeks, okay, maybe find a way around it. But if you're feeling that way for like a couple days here or 1 week was kind of blah, give yourself more time first. Because I think it's also easy to be like, well, I'm just bored. And then you end up program hopping or having no clear goal because you're just chasing novelty. And like, yes, that is kind of counterproductive. Let's be 100%. Honest. Giving yourself time to properly evaluate that mental block is just as important as giving yourself time to evaluate any other form of progress.
Yeah. And last thing, when it comes to the boredom thing, like you better be good at getting bored and staying bored, quote unquote, because that the people who see the best progress ever are so good at doing the same thing over and over again. You think Roger Federer got good at serving by serving and be like, I've served so much, I don't feel like this anymore. I'm going to go play ping pong. And then be like, I've hit a lot of ping pong balls. I got kind of bored. I'm going to try rowing. No, he was serving for decades, right? Same thing in your fitness journey. Oh, I really want to make progress, but you know what? Going to the gym is kind of boring. I'm doing workouts. I've been doing this for so long. It's like, get used to it if you want to see progress. I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. No, but we're not going for the most exciting. We're going for trying to make some progress here.
That's a good point. So, I think that's fair way to help you evaluate your plateau is like, if your plateau is boredom, might need to think about some different solutions. But hopefully, either way, today's episode did help you take a different view of identifying if you're in a plateau. So you can now understand if your goal is fat loss or muscle growth. Is it fair to say you're in a plateau? Or are there things you might need to check in on before you start to evaluate that? If you do feel like you are feeling stuck in your fitness journey, I'm going to raise my hand for those who are listening and not watching. I'm raising my hand because we are here to help. We're here to help you break through those plateaus when you are experiencing them, or help evaluate when you are, because sometimes you just need someone else to tell you that you're ready to make an adjustment. I will say that's like the biggest value I think I take from my coach is like, I don't have to make that decision for myself. I have someone else who can help me evaluate. And I love that. Objectively, yes, because I'm not a fair judge of my own experience. I'd be like, yeah, just give me more food. I want to eat more. Sure. Maybe not the right call. If you do need an objective eye on whether or not you're in a plateau, we're here to help. If you have any questions as follow-ups, because we know that this isn't as clear cut. This is one of those episodes where I think a lot of it is, it depends on this and it depends on that. Like, we don't have a straight answer. But hopefully there are some guidelines now for you to follow to help evaluate if you're at a plateau in your fitness journey and what to do next.
People probably created 10 more questions by this answer to this question.
Probably. But we're giving you stuff to think about, which I think is our ultimate goal.
Yeah. Awesome.
All right. So without further ado, we will leave you for this week, and we'll be back in your feeds next Monday with another episode of Truth Talks. Stay tuned to find out what question we're going to answer next. Bye for now.
Bye.